Hello, this is Reverend Dr. Chris Wilson again, and thank you for coming back to this third session on the Gospel of Matthew that explores the Jewish heritage and the rabbinical qualities of Matthew's Gospel. Today's study is focused on the second discourse that Jesus offers in the Gospel of Matthew, and that particular discourse can be found in chapter 10. So this is the second major teaching moment in Matthew's Gospel that Jesus offers. One of the things that's important about this particular discourse, it's called the Mission Discourse. In you look at commentaries and other work on the Gospel of Matthew, it's often labeled the Mission Discourse. And this is the portion where Jesus begins to broaden his impact with the disciples. And this is where he begins to empower and strengthen disciples to go out and do the very work that he's doing or has already done in chapters 8 and 9. 5, 6, and 7 was Sermon on the Mount. 8 and 9, Jesus goes and kind of practices all those things he talked about. And then 10, he circles back around and says, I'm going to broaden this leadership out in more direct ways, and begins sharing with the disciples in this chapter what it means for them to be in the role that he's in. This group of disciples, we have to remember, are not ready-made teachers and proclaimers. This band of people that Jesus gathered around him were kind of from the edges of life. We're talking people that were fishermen and tax collectors, and these were not people steeped in the tradition of the Jewish law or way of life. They were kind of out and probably either forgotten or considered lesser important individuals. These people were not ready to be out in front being teachers and healers and guiders of this movement that Jesus started. And so for Jesus to take this on was no small task. He was lifting up some people that would not have been felt equipped to do the work that he's about them to teach them to do. But that's kind of what's happening. He essentially you think of a race, a relay race where there's a baton passed from one person to the next. This is like a relay race where Jesus is about to pass the baton from himself to the disciples, saying, you're up next and you can do this work. John Meyer, who's one of the scholars on Matthew, says that there are three distinct things that happen in chapter 10 of Matthew in terms of what Jesus is asking the disciples to do. He's asking them to teach, he's asking them to proclaim, and he's asking them to heal. And that teaching, proclaiming, and healing are the very things that Jesus is doing when he's out doing his ministry. He's teaching, he's proclaiming, he's healing. He's now going to have the disciples doing those very same things with him and for him. So some of the times the disciples will be doing it with him, and then as we'll see, he'll be sending them out to go do it on their own in his name in behalf of God. And so we have that going on. So when we think about this, the level of discipleship is being ratcheted up quite a bit. He is raising the bar in discipleship. Discipleship is reaching the point in chapter 10. It's no longer just about being a follower of Jesus. You've got to be a part of the leadership team and leading, and not just being present. You've got to be part of the activity of leading and doing the very work that Jesus is doing. And so Jesus thinks they're capable of doing it. In this chapter 10, it's all about giving them the confidence and strength to do the very things that he's been doing already. The way forward for the disciples requires some detailed instructions. And so chapter 10 kind of has a formula to it. There's lots of pieces to chapter 10 that are important. The first part of chapter 10 that we get for the first time in the gospel is the naming of the disciples. At the very beginning of chapter 10, he names all 12 disciples. There have been some call stories in Matthew, but up to this point we've only had a few, and we don't know who all the disciples are. But Jesus names them by name. All 12 of them are named at the beginning of chapter 10. And once he kind of names them, it kind of helps us know who are these people that are going to be following and doing the work with Jesus going forward. There's a kind of an accountability. When your name is called, you feel like you're called to attention almost. And when your name is called, You have a place of significance in the work. It's no longer being these unnamed disciples, these people we don't know about. By giving them a name and giving them that credibility, he is heightening their role and their importance in his life. So the chapter kind of unfolds in different parts. The first part is kind of a logistics section, kind of the how-tos. When you travel, take this, don't take this. When you get to this city, this is how you behave in the city. When you stay in someone's house, this is kind of how you, what kind of etiquette there is when you stay in someone's house. And so the first part of chapter 10 is logistics of how you move in and amongst the communities they'll be traveling to. Traveling light, traveling smart is kind of the way Jesus kind of unfolds this early part of chapter 10. Then he kind of gives them some fair warning that this work they're doing is not for the faint of heart. They're about to do some significant work, do some challenging work. They are sharing a message that is fresh and new, that these listeners had not heard before. There'll be many people that are just going to reject what they have to say, but there will be some that are ready and willing to listen to this new message the disciples will offer. But he's kind of warning them that this is not some easy thing that's going to be disseminated among them. He reminds them there's obstacles and challenges along the way to help them overcome their fears, not to be fearful of what they're doing, that the work is well worth whatever fears come within them. They have the abilities and the strength and supported by Jesus himself to do the work that's with them and for them. Then the end, he kind of has kind of a carrot at the end. He kind of offers them rewards that you do this work, God will take care of you. Don't worry about your future. God has your back. God's going to be with you all along the way. So there's kind of this naming, there's this logistical preparation, there's this warnings about the hard pieces of this, kind of overcoming the fear that they may feel inside, and then to feel a sense of accomplishment in the end, that God stands beside them and with them all along the way. Matthew chapter 10 kind of has its own little outline, and I'm going to put a screen on for you to see, but as you can see here on the screen, Matthew kind of breaks down the chapter in this way. There's the naming of the disciples. You have what I call the mission logistics, the challenging circumstances of their work. The section called Do Not Fear is things not to be fearful of when fear would have been a pretty predominant feeling in their life. And then the reward for faithfulness that comes in the end. So that's kind of the outline of how chapter 10 unfolds. As chapter 10 opens up and he summons those disciples, one of the things he does that is very intentional is he wants to give them authority. There's many times the crowds reference Jesus as he taught as one who had authority. And that idea of passing on authority is important. It's not just, this is how you do the work. He's not just passing on the logistics of what to do. He actually is passing on the mantle of authority to them. It's the same authority by which he conducts his ministry. And this authority passed on is meant to reflect the same ministry that Jesus is doing. It's also this notion of passing on authority to the disciples is instilling confidence in these individuals for the work that they're doing. That it's not just like, well, I hope it goes well for you. Jesus almost kind of, in a sense, lays on hands. He doesn't actually lay on hands, but it's almost like an empowering, commissioning, instilling confidence that they can do this work and that he empowers them to do this work. And out of that challenge, he hints in this chapter with a little foreshadowing, I think, that the fate of Jesus is kind of at hand. He says, whoever does not take up the cross and follow me is not worthy. Jesus says this task of being a disciple of me and teaching and preaching and healing in my name is significant, hard, demanding work. And so the idea of them taking up their cross is almost a foreshadowing of what is going to happen to Jesus at the end of the gospel with his own crucifixion. I'm sure the disciples would take up your cross. I mean, cross is death. I'm not sure I'm in for this cross thing. But Jesus says you must be willing to go to the end. You must be willing to give up every ounce of your soul for this work, for the sharing of this message of God's love in the world. It means and asks everything of you. And so this passing on authority is not just, wow, Jesus gave this ability to do these things. It's Jesus is asking me to dedicate every fiber of my being to share this message with people who need to hear it. One other piece I think that's important in chapter 10 to highlight, and that is the audience of which the disciples will go to. It's referenced in verses 5 and 6 that he's going to the lost sheep of Israel and not among the Gentiles. Is that initially the disciples are meant to go to a Jewish audience to speak to Jewish people. And some of those are the lost sheep of Israel, kind of references people on the Jewish margins of life, those that have strayed from the path that leads them to God. And that this is a grassroots movement. They are doing this from the grassroots up. It's not some top-down hierarchy. They're going in amongst the people, sharing their love, sharing their message with conviction, with the authority Jesus gives them, and trying to gather people together to reclaim and re-put together the very people that God inspired us to be. Tom Long, who is also another author of Matthew, says the sending out's not meant to be an exclusive message only to the Jewish audience, but that Jesus really has the disciples start with the Jewish audience. Though the work is demanding and hard, at least it's to a people that are familiar with the tradition of which they are a part. And Tom likens it, the image I would use, he almost likens it, he's first going to the Jewish people, sending the disciples to Jewish people. It's almost like throwing a rock into the water, a pebble into the water, and we see the ripple effects of that message. That first kind of ripple that the disciples will engage is a Jewish audience. It's only later, as those ripples kind of expand out, that they will eventually get to a Gentile audience, but he's having them start with a Jewish audience as they initiate this beginning work of teaching and preaching and healing. A distinction that's important to make between the first discourse, which I talked about last time, which was the Sermon on the Mount, chapters 5, 6, and 7. That particular discourse really focuses on personal discipleship. The second discourse in chapter 10, the Mission Discourse, moves from personal to communal. As they're going from discipleship of figuring it out inside to discipleship is something we do together, not just something I do on my own. Gene Boring suggests that this discourse is widening the mission of Jesus to include the disciples as part of disseminating that message to others. Our second discourse, this chapter 10 of Matthew, is about empowerment and mentoring to prepare the disciples to stand on their own rather than leaning on Jesus himself. And this is the kind of faith we are hoping for ourselves and others to have, is that when we think about faith, we don't want to depend on others to feed us everything we need for our faith. We want we want to create a faith that we are cultivating ourselves. And Jesus is creating that same cultivation in the disciples. And that cultivation Jesus does in the disciples is the same thing we're doing in church. We want us to be able to think for ourselves and make our own declarations and massage and challenge and question and doubt and figure it out ourselves. Is that when Jesus is no longer with them, these disciples are going to have to function without Jesus with them and be able to have those discerning skills and decision-making skills and confidence skills to live out their faith with hope and vibrancy, grace, and love. We want faith not to be dependent on others, though it is an interdependent exercise, that we can stand alone, that we have abilities ourselves to create a faith that's meaningful and hopeful for our lives. So this kind of is a wrap-up of chapter 10 and the Mission Discourse. And next time we will lean into the third discourse, and it is the discourse, it's chapter 13 in Matthew. It's kind of the parable chapter. It's where Jesus begins to teach in parables and begins to kind of teach in a new way. And the entire chapter 13 is all about parables and the intention of parables and the significance of parables. And so we'll make a move as we move into session 4 to talk about the parable discourse in chapter 13. Thanks for being with me today as we've talked about chapter 10. Look forward to next time as we talk about the third discourse in Matthew's Gospel.